Hello there, and welcome back to The Closet Historian and back to my sewing parlor for another volume of Drafting Dangerous. Today I thought I would go over some basic sleeve modifications, showing how I add puff to sleeves and things like that. And like all pattern manipulation, once you have the basic blocks in place, this is the fun and easy part, so let's go ahead and dive on in. And of course, I'm beginning with my basic block sleeve, which is a long sleeve with an elbow dart here. And I've just traced the top 5 inches or so of this so that I can demonstrate a few basic concepts to start. And grabbing this first sheet here, I think I will go ahead and show you how to add puff to the top of your sleeve cap first. Because puff sleeves in general were extremely common, well, all throughout history, but especially in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, you're going to want to know how to add extra ease into your sleeve cap. So I'm going to draw in my center here, and then I'll come out and draw a line 1 inch either side of that, and then 2 inches either side of those 2 new lines. Basically, you want to keep your flare lines about 3 or 4 inches away from the side seam of the sleeve, the underarm seam. So remember that there is seam allowance in here and that this is the underarm seam of the sleeve. We can make this a little bit shorter as well. Maybe make this around 3 inches long or so, a slightly shorter puff sleeve. It's important to know, like on your sleeve, of course, the elbow dart is around the elbow level, so that kind of helps you judge how short your sleeve will be. Now from the top of my sleeve cap here, I will cut down along those indication lines that we made, either side of the center, and then another 2.5 inches out from each side. I think I said 2 inches, but 2.5 too. It doesn't actually really matter. We're just adding puff into the top of the sleeve. A lot of the modifications I'll be showing you today, actually, there are several different ways to do this, and if you look up how to make a puff sleeve pattern on Pinterest, you will see every different book has a slightly different recommendation on how to do this, especially with things like leg of mutton sleeves that have been around a very long time. There have been several different methods devised on how to make the best quote-unquote sleeve pattern, and you just have to kind of figure out which works best for you. But really, I don't normally actually measure this kind of thing. Here you can see I'm adding 1.5 inches of flare to the first 2 splits near the center, and then separating the other 2 flares around 1 inch. This is not a ton of puff. Again, how much puff you want to add is all up to you, and the width and height of your sleeve is going to determine what the finished product looks like, but so is the textile. So if you cut this out in a taffeta, it's going to look very different than if you cut it out in a flowy like silk georgette or chiffon or something. So remember, the amount of puff you need both depends on your pattern drafting here, but also on the textile itself. So I'm just flaring this open along these lines. These are not darts, this is just extra flare that we are adding into the pattern. You can see that the hem of the sleeve is now curved, and we are going to need to raise this sleeve cap as well. Add a little bit of extra height in here. I think Joseph Armstrong recommends 2 inches up here. I usually just do around 1 to 1.5. And then I'll just smooth this sleeve cap back out. And I remember where I need to gather this down, like so. And essentially the sleeve is now finished. We have a short puff sleeve with a slightly curved hem going on here. And once you do have a curved hem like this on a sleeve or anything, I highly recommend bias tape, a curved matching facing, or a lining to be able to finish this bottom edge. Of course, you could always try a binding as well, or some sort of a trim, but folding it over twice is more annoying when it is curved like this, of course. And because a short puff sleeve pattern is something I find useful to have knocking around my sewing room, I'm going to go ahead and just finish this off, tape down my floops, because I'll keep this pattern aside for the next time I want to pull out a short puff sleeve. I do keep my sleeve patterns. I have them all in a bag, which honestly I need to go through and cull. But I do keep my sleeve patterns aside because I'm always working from the same block pattern base, which means all of my sleeves fit into all my other things. So unless I've dramatically changed something, then I will custom cut a sleeve. Usually all of these sleeves are interchangeable to all of the bodices I've ever made, so I can kind of mix and match to create a new dress pattern here in my studio. But what if you wanted to add some puff at the sleeve cap of a longer sleeve, which is a sleeve I use far more than the short sleeve version in my own sewing. And here is a sleeve with a slight bit of height and puff added to it that I've been using for several years. You can see it's wrinkled from overuse. And I've used this style on everything from a cotton day dress to, of course, overly embellished brocade evening jackets. And while you can use that first method, just going all the way down to the cuff of the long sleeve as well, it is going to add a little bit more width through the rest of the sleeve, through the entire length of the sleeve, which may not be something you are after. So if you only want to add puff up here at the very top of the sleeve, I do use a slightly different method to do that, so I will go ahead and show you. So first I'm going to make an indication on either side of the center of my sleeve here, 2 inches out. along the sleeve cap here. I'm going to connect that down with an angled line to the center point of where the center line of the sleeve and the bicep line meet. Then I will go ahead and cut down from the center to that point and then cut out to the underarm on either side. So I can now have a hinge point up here just in the sleeve cap, like so. And then I will cut down the other hinge points as well here so that I can distribute this additional flare evenly. Snip that down, just leave myself again a tiny hinge point, like so. Now, of course, you can open this up as much as you want. Again, the width and the height are what are going to determine how much puff you end up with in your sleeve. So if you really wanted to add a ton of puff up here, kind of you can. Your sleeve pattern is going to end up looking kind of strange, and actually a little bit more like 1890s sleeve patterns, because they did use this method to create leg of mutton sleeves in a way as well. Although usually not just the cap, usually lower into the sleeve, closer to the elbow, is where that would start. But I'm going to tape this down to a new piece of scratch paper and draw in a new center line to line up with the first here. Then I can open this up, and it will both increase the height and again the width of my sleeve cap here, but it's also increasing there's like a crescent of fullness being added right across the bicep at the top of the sleeve as well. So you kind of have to control this and decide what compromise you're interested in. I usually add about 1 inch here down the center of the sleeve, which opens up the sleeve cap just a little bit. It gives me just that little bit of puff, little bit of height to accent the shoulder and create a slightly stronger shoulder without going too, 1980s overboard. In my opinion, that is. Design is subjective. But once I have this opened up, I will distribute the fullness created along the cap here between the openings and then tape everything down, including all little floopies so that nothing gets caught and torn and ripped, especially because I will definitely use this pattern here in my studio, so I want to make sure I make this a nice version. And while the sleeve cap has been slightly raised from the center in this method, I am going to add on an additional inch as well to the top of this, just again to create a slightly longer line to gather into my same-sized arm side. The arm side on the bodice has not changed. We're just modifying the sleeve cap that gets set into it. And again, we want to concentrate the gathering when we actually do the stitching up here 4 or 5 inches out from the underarm seam. So I'm just making sure that my eyeballing here is in that range. So all this will be gathered down. The center will still be lined up with the shoulder seam in the end. And now I have a slightly puffed long sleeve, which still has its elbow dart and is slim-ish through the rest of the sleeve, but has this extra fullness up here at the sleeve cap. Long puff sleeve 2025. Definitely going to keep this one knocking about. Something I, again, reach for all the time. So you can see these are 2 different methods for adding puff to a sleeve, just depending on the length of the sleeve itself. Again, you can use either of these methods for the other style. So if you wanted to keep this sleeve, instead of having this curved hem, you wanted to keep it straight across and just puff the cap on a short sleeve, you totally could. Use that second method for a short sleeve. And you can also use this first method of opening up the entire sleeve with flare on a longer sleeve as well. It's just going to result in a slightly different silhouette. So first dial in on what you're after and what textile you intend to use with something like this before you get started with your pattern manipulation. But that is how I generally go about adding puff to my sleeve cap. But of course, you can also add puff to your sleeve cuff as well, which does unfortunately rhyme. So puff to the cuff, come out 1 inch from either side of the center line on my sleeve here, and again 2 inches out from there. 2 to 3 inches, depending on the size of your sleeve. It's fine. Again, it's a lot more flexible than you would think, as long as you keep it away from the underarm, because again, unless, you're making a design decision and you want to have a flared or puffed underarm, it just doesn't sound very comfortable. Kind of sounds bulky, I'm not going to lie. But again, we're going to separate this out with the hinge points along the cap this time, which you can see really flattens out from doing this. But since we're adding extra flare into the equation, although the distortion is shortening the sleeve cap, it doesn't result in a loss of movement or fit. But anyhow, I need to go ahead and find some spare paper, tape that together so I can tape my piece down and open up and add flare into this bottom section. And just like when adding puff at the top of the sleeve cap, we are going to want to dip this hem down just a little bit as well to create that kind of bubbling over of a sleeve when it hangs down. I always think of these as kind of like a Snow White or like 1930s princess sleeve. It's not something I ever really reach for. As close as I get is where I do the puff on the bottom and the top, but I never just do puff at the hem. You kind of have to either gather it into a cuff or put an elastic casing down here. Do something to, of course, control this. The other option for that would be to actually make a tracing of your initial sleeve before you add in this flare and use the standardized sleeve as a lining and then just put the puff on the outside and gather it down to the lining itself, which is how I made the sleeves on my black brocade jacket like this. So I can actually link this for you in the description below. I actually have puff at the shoulder as well, but the whole idea of having a slimmer sleeve on the inside and then puffing everything on the outside is still something I demonstrated in that project. Puff at the cuff sleeve, November 2025. Again, just dipped that a little bit lower. Now the sleeve cap and the sleeve hem look very similar, but I promise it works out in the end. Some sleeves end up looking very distorted and strange, especially tulip sleeves, which end up looking like some sort of a ginkgo leaf. But yeah, personally, I don't tend to use the puff at the cuff. It is just something that I know you might want to have as an option. When I'm adding puff to the cuff, it's because I want to make a long sleeve, so I'll cover that in a moment. But if you wanted to add width and height all along your sleeve, again, you're going to separate it into the same 3 sections. You can separate it into more sections, by the way, and evenly distribute this, but at some point it doesn't really matter as long as the end shape ends up the same, which is part of the reason why there are so many methods to achieve the same end sleeve shape. But instead of adding flare to either the sleeve cuff or the sleeve cap, I'm going to go ahead and add flare to both by just separating these sections out and taping them an inch apart. That is after I'm done being attacked by the cat. And again, this is the sleeve that I used for these little jackets. I made that black one and then also this in a sort of aqua metallic, strange shantung fabric. But that is a shorter sleeve with both cuff puff and sleeve cap puff. Cuff puff. You heard me. That sounds like it could be something else, I'll be honest. Now, if you wanted to add puff at the shoulder and then widen the sleeve into a bishop sleeve as well, this is what that would look like. I use that all the time. So usually when I'm creating a billowing large sleeve, it's with puff down at the cuffs of a long sleeve and then with more puff at the top. So you could do this exact same method you see me working on here on a full length sleeve as well, though it's probably best to start with a sleeve where you have straightened off the sides of that, which I will cover slightly later in this video and actually went over in my shirt video, so I'll link that in a card here. Again, I need to add 1 inch to both the cuff and to the cap here and then just blend that back into the standard sleeve. All this would be gathered down. Again, we don't want to add any extra gathering to the underarm area. We want to avoid bulk there so that we can keep things comfy. Full puff or double puff short sleeve here. Go ahead and label that. And then I will cut everything apart and of course tape down the rest of my floops. If you wanted to have like a sleeve day where you just make a couple of different sleeve styles, test them out in muslin and then have them ready to go for your next project, it's not actually a bad idea to have like a weekend of sleeves, figure out what you like, and then just keep them aside to call upon. And Oliver required more cuddles. No one is surprised. He gets extra kisses, and hopefully I'll annoy him to the point that he can give me some time to work on other things. Anyhow, let me go ahead and demonstrate a sort of bishop sleeve, and this is actually one I have not tried before, so I'm excited to pull out this pattern and use it in a future project. I was going to separate this into the standard kind of like 4 equal sections, but then I ended up just coming a little bit closer to the center. I don't know why I like to keep things concentrated there. I feel like the most flare and puff needs to be on the outside of the sleeve where it will be seen and appreciated, I suppose. So I'm going to come out 3 inches from either side of the center here and just draw in some indication lines for me. And then I will go ahead and extend my dart leg all the way to that line back here on the elbow. And I will close my elbow dart and open that as flare into the cuff, which is something that you can always do at any time if you wanted to have a seam here. But I cut up the rest of the line all the way up to a hinge point in the sleeve cap, and I'm just going to hinge this open another inch here right where the elbow dart used to be, and then I'll fill in all this space that has opened up in the back half of my sleeve. This added in a good 4 inches of flare back here, while keeping the top of the sleeve above the elbow area quite slim. So I'm adding in flare back here, but because I used the dart partially as a way to do that, I've added in more flare to the lower half of the sleeve than the top. Hopefully that makes some sense. Often a bridal sleeve or a 2-part sleeve starts by closing this elbow dart. And often the elbow dart gets ignored entirely, especially if you're opening a sleeve up and adding a lot of flare to it. You no longer want it to fit close, which is what that elbow dart is there to facilitate. And I'm going to add in flare to the front indication as well, like so. You can add as much as you want in here, maybe make it match the back. I'm just going to add in a good 1.5 inches here for this one today. And you can definitely make exaggerated bishop sleeves, which is again something I think I've done here on the channel before. I have made hundreds of videos and projects at this point, so I can't keep everything straight anymore, sadly enough. But you can, of course, separate this into more sections and even add in flare down that center line as well. Really expand this up and add in as much as you want. Again, as much puff and gathering as you would like, you can always add it in there. Just make sure that your textile can handle it. So if you're working with a very thin cotton or silk, go for it. Add in as much puff as you can ever dream up. But if you're working with a thick wool coating, you are going to run into some frustration. So just be careful when it comes to the intended end textile. Now when I draw in a new hem here, just like when I'm adding puff to a shorter sleeve, I need to dip this hem down a little bit extra, and a little bit more so in the back of the sleeve than the front. So I'm going to draw in a curved line that takes that into account, dipping kind of lower in the back end of the sleeve. Again, you can do this around 1 or 2 inches. You can make it very dramatic depending on if you're using a silk organza. You could get away with a very dramatic bubbling over the hand. Could be quite fun in actually several different fabrics. Again, just remember this is going to have to be gathered into some sort of a cuff or into a casing or something like that, unless you are trying to create a trumpet sleeve and just want a flared sleeve as opposed to a bishop sleeve, which I will talk about in a moment as well. Honestly, before I use this sleeve, I probably will open up that center mark and add in another good 3 or 4 inches, just because I personally do like a very large bishop sleeve. Just make sure that your underarm seam still matches up, by the way. And here is a project that I made here on the channel in the past, showing what a sleeve like this, taken to an extreme, can look like. This has a perfectly smooth cap at the top, but a lot of puff down here at the cuff, so I can link this project video in the description as well. And I did make that sleeve with my standard shirt sleeve as a starting point, as opposed to opening up the back elbow dart like this, but I think this might be a fun variation to try out next. Basic quote-unquote bishop sleeve, done in the sort of hybrid TCH method. And my next piece of paper is occupied. No one is surprised. Can I use that, buddy? Thank you so much. Sorry there, man. He stayed, actually. All right, so I have another tracing of my sleeve here, and I just wanted to pause and show you what I've done to the sides of this. So I'm going to be flaring this entirely and therefore ignoring the back elbow dart. We don't need to fit this any closer to the body. I'm going to be making it larger. You can see here the original seam lines of my underarm seam are in blue, those angled lines that would slim a little bit as the sleeve goes down my arm. But in this case, I'm going to be making the sleeve a lot wider, so I just went ahead and straightened those off and then straightened off the hem as well. So the only real fitted part of this that remains is the sleeve cap for now. But of course, you could always add sleeve cap puff to a sleeve like this as well, which is something I have done here in the past again on the channel. All right, unpause. I'm going to come out 2 inches from either side of the center, surprising no one, and then I'm going to come out another 2 inches from there on either side. So I have 5 opening points here to add flare in along the hem of my sleeve. Let's go ahead and make this look positively medieval. Well, the costumey version of medieval with those lovely flared fantasy sleeves. All right, cut out my sleeve itself here. As you can see, it's now rather rectangular and boxy as before we add in any flare. This is very similar to flaring the A-line skirt again, although we don't have any darts to close. This is like the dartless A-line variation. Again, it's just adding flare wherever you want it, with no regard to the rules, honestly. And again, here is an example of how I've used flared sleeves in the past. And again, this one does have a little bit of puff up at the shoulder as well. And a split down the front of the sleeve lined in iridescent polyester, but you see what I mean. So just cutting up from the cuff of the sleeve all the way to the sleeve cap, leaving those hinge points in place. Then I have to find enough spare paper to completely flare this out. Again, you can flare this as much as you want. Is the sleeve cap at the top going to change shape quite a lot? Yes, do not worry about it. The actual length of the sleeve cap has not changed where it would be set into the arm side. Does that make any sense? So we're not adding anything like if you were to measure the part of the sleeve cap that gets set in, it stays the same. So you can add as much flare in as you want elsewhere without changing the sleeve cap the math of it. Hopefully that, again, makes any sense. I'm not making any sense today. I do apologize. I did just spend a week sitting on the floor in my kitchen/dining room, chipping off the old laminate with a chisel and a hammer. And therefore, neither my body nor my brain are working at 100% full capacity. But I think I'm going to try and add in 3 inches of flare to each of these openings to create a much more A-line cut of sleeve. Although, honestly, this is not going hard enough. For most of us, if we're going to do a flared sleeve, you might as well do an epically large one. Am I right? And unfortunately, the more scraps of paper you reuse when making patterns, because you can see I have all these scraps laying around me, I can put all those little scraps together, but then I'll have to use more tape. So is it better to use a new sheet of paper that's larger and therefore kind of less tape, or to use the tiny scraps of paper and use more tape? Hard to say. Scotch tape is made with a kind of weird sort of plastic, but I highly doubt it's actually biodegradable fully. So, chemists, let me know. I am going to redraw in my center line on this sleeve just because it's important when it comes to cutting something like this out if you wanted to cut it out on grain. And again, my floopies. There's still a few on here. Running a risky game. And if I were to sew this underarm seam, you can get an idea of what this sleeve would be shaped like when it fits onto the bodice. Now, tulip sleeves are another style you see me use all the time. I'm actually quite in love with tulip sleeves anymore. I usually use a puffed version, and I think they're a little bit more interesting than the standard just basic puff sleeve. And I do have an entire video dedicated to making tulip sleeve patterns, so I can also link you to that video in the description because personally I am a huge fan of this style. And another sleeve you have seen me use quite often is the all-in-one sleeve, which is not a separate pattern piece at all, but just a modification made to the basic bodice block. And I do have a video all about that I can link for you in the description below. The all-in-one sleeve was incredibly popular in the mid-century era and is something that I use constantly in my own design work and my own sewing. So in addition to the dedicated video from many years ago that I have on this style, you will also be able to find many examples of it in other videos here on the channel. So these are a couple of simple sleeve modifications that I use all the time in my own sewing and design work, and I do hope that you will find this video useful. Of course, there are an endless amount of different sleeve patterns out there and different ways to create them. Honestly, different ways of modifying things to get to the same sleeve. I've seen many different ways, for example, to get to a leg of mutton sleeve. I've tried several. They all seem to work reasonably well, and I am sure I will be covering different sleeve styles here in Drafting Dangerous in the future, so please include anything you would like to see specifically in the comments below. And thank you as always for watching today, and a huge thank you to my patrons who make my work and these videos possible. And if you too would like to help me keep creating videos like these here on the channel and keep renovating my little 1890s house here, please consider giving my Patreon a peruse. I will of course link it in the description below. And as always, I'll be back drafting dangerously again with you here real soon, so I'll see you then. Bye.